Rashad, the philosopher that you're talking about, is it pronounced Piperian? I'm not familiar with that philosopher, and I want to
If
make sure.
it if it makes you feel any better, he's like entirely out of the title as I've sort of reworded it. So you're all good. But if you want to, it's a his name is Joseph Pieper. So I guess it's like
Or
Piperian.
Piperian. Okay. What
Yeah.
title would you like me to use?
I mean, you can use the one that you have there. It's no problem. But
Oh,
but in the new one, it's just
okay.
I omitted it.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
All right. I did the same on my paper. By the time I wrote it, the title I originally had no longer made sense. So, but that's what happens at conferences. So,
It does.
all right. So we'll give folks just one more minute, and we'll just keep things on time. And I will give each of you 20 minutes. I'll give you a 2-minute warning at 18. 5 minutes isn't a lot of time for questions, but if there's time after all three presentations and Q&A, we can do some more. So in the interest of giving you all of the time that I can, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. And our first panelist is Molly Kelly, who is from Emory University. And her paper today is Aristotle Revisited, Hybrid Regimes, Nominal Transformation, and the Sense of Injustice.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to re-share screen, hopefully without issue. Just quick nod. Does that work for people? Awesome. Okay. Hi, everyone. It's really great to see you. So today for this presentation, I'm largely concerned with discussions surrounding the emergence and relative stability of hybrid regimes, and also just institutional ambiguities more broadly as they relate to questions of democracy and justice. More specifically, I aim to demonstrate how Aristotle's politics may help us better understand the role affect and perception play in regime transitions, or alternatively, regimes' failure to transition. Focusing specifically on Aristotle's description of the tyrant in Book 5 of the Politics, I suggest that Aristotle anticipates much of the phenomena observable in modern-day hybrid regimes, including the institutional use of safety valves, which I'll get into later. Beyond this, though, I also want to argue that the Politics proves fruitful not just to theories of democratic transformation, but also to theories of state preservation more broadly. So turning to the works of Michelle Alexander, Jennifer Nash, and Martin Luther King, I conclude by considering how the sense of justice, as Aristotle articulates it, has been and continues to be operationalized by harmful status regimes. So to just give brief background, in discussing hybrid regimes or governments that combine both democratic and autocratic traits like elections and political repression, many political theorists are interested in examining the manners in which some regimes are able to create this institutional facade of democracy that makes them difficult to neatly categorize. So while regime typologies have expanded to include hybrid regimes such as electoral authoritarianism or illiberal democracy, hybrid regimes really aptly underscore how processes of political transformation remain complex, long-term, and open-ended processes. So as a kind of mixed regime, it is relevant to note that Aristotle himself describes mixed forms of government and suggests that a mixed regime may actually be the best form of government. So for example, Aristotle describes 3 true forms of government, which include monarchy, aristocracy, and polity, and their possible perversions, which are tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. Additionally, he notes that these forms aren't static, but they exist in both degrees and modes of combination. So for Aristotle, degrees describe the manner in which a government may be more or less oligarchical and how those boundaries can remain a little porous. And by modes of combination, he is more clearly describing modern understandings of mixed regimes, wherein a government may have some oligarchical aspects, some democratic aspects, something like that. But specifically important for our discussion of hybrid regimes as opposed to just mixed regimes in general is the fact that the democratic elements of hybrid regimes, as in electoral authoritarianism, say, are largely seen as being nominal. So in other words, they do not actually jeopardize the regime's status or power. And while many theorists explore the social, economic, and geopolitical requisites that may be necessary for democratic success and for transition, other scholars question the behavioral and affective commitments that democracy might require. So, for example, Larry Diamond stresses the importance of democratic consolidation, or the deep, routinized commitments that democracy and its procedures require at both the elite and mass levels. Diamond's going to argue that democratic policies and procedures alone are not enough. Both elites and masses must share normative and behavioral commitments to the central premises of democratic governance. Responding to Phileas' suggestion that certain economic requisites will lead to a just government in the politics, Aristotle makes the remark that, quote, "It is not just the possessions, but the desires of humankind which require to be equalized," end quote. We can certainly debate what this means in the limit of this phrase, but it's interesting to think that in Aristotle's terms, hybrid regimes' use of nominal democratic functions do not equalize the desire of political elites, and subsequently cannot bring about full regime change. So true democratic transformation will thus require more than just procedural change, but also deep affective and epistemic commitments to the idea that democracy is the only viable framework for governing, and that this will advance everyone's interests. So if we accept that consolidation is an important part of democratic transitions or just democratic governance, we might also question how procedural changes without real democratic commitments can be intentionally used in order to stave off processes of democratization. So as an offspring of democratization theory, safety valve theory describes how hybrid regimes maintain power through the use of institutionalized democratic safety valves. Studying the use of safety valves in elections in Moroccan politics and in the 2009 election in Morocco, Matt Buehler defines safety valves as a process whereby, quote, "regimes develop nonviolent vehicles through which opponents think, whether correctly or incorrectly, that they can attain their goals," end quote. So by utilizing nonviolent vehicles such as elections or mild tolerance of public criticism, incumbent elites are able to release political affect and energy without actually jeopardizing their positions. So in other words, safety valves help redirect the energy of the people so as to avoid violent upheaval and or calls for revolution. And by using these institutional forms of safety valves, regimes are better able to create what Daniel Brumberg calls, quote, "a protracted cycle in which rulers widen or narrow the boundaries of participation and expression in response to what they see as the social, economic, political, and geostrategic challenges facing their regimes," end quote. So resonating with much of Buehler's argument about safety valves, Aristotle also discusses the ways in which incumbent elites, or in his specific conversation, tyrants, are able to protect their positions by creating an artificial sense of justice. So in book 5 of the Politics, Aristotle describes two types of tyrants. I'm going to call them oppressive and kingly because they don't have names. But the first is perhaps the more colloquial understanding of a tyrant as someone who uses violence, force, corruption, and fear in order to maintain power. To preserve their regime, Aristotle writes that these tyrants, quote, "lop off those who are too high, put to death men of spirit, and take every means to prevent people from knowing one another," end quote. And while he recognizes that this type of regime is temporarily effective, he warns that this sort of violent tyranny never lasts for particularly long, and that the tyrant must be on constant guard against possible destruction, both from the people and from within the regime itself. So responding to these limitations of the violent tyrant, Aristotle's writing takes a kind of curious turn at this point in the book, as Michael Davis recounts in a really kind of rather Machiavellian way. Aristotle goes on to suggest that, quote, "the clearest and surest way for a tyrant to preserve his rule is to appear just," end quote. So in observing the comparative success of monarchies, Aristotle suggests that if one mode of destroying monarchies is for a king to become tyrannical, a way to salvage a tyranny is for a tyrant to appear like the rule of a king. So contrary to the first tyrant's use of force, Aristotle writes that the second tyrant ought to invest in and improve their city, quote, as though they were not a tyrant, but the guardian of a state, end quote. So additionally, he holds that the tyrant should not appear harsh, but dignified, so much so that the people look upon them with reverence. He suggests that the tyrant should hide all of his vices, attempting instead to appear earnest in service of the gods. So from all of this, I suggest that Aristotle's tyrant effectively uses monarchic safety valves in order to maintain power. So just as hybrid regimes utilize non-violent vehicles in order to appear more democratic, so too does Aristotle's tyrant use moderation and kingliness in order to appear more just. So through the appearance of earnestness and dignity, the tyrant is able to quell the political discontent of the people. This superficial form of justice then forces the people into this affectively and epistemically ambiguous space, which, for as David asserts, quote, the appearance of justice is not so easy to distinguish from justice if you are on the receiving end, end quote. So important throughout this section and this part of Aristotle's discussion is this repeated use of and emphasis on appearance, or how the tyrant should create this sense of kingliness. In chronicling the various sources of political unrest that can befall a regime, Aristotle argues that the most common cause of revolution in his view is a sense of injustice amongst the people. So looking specifically at revolutions within monarchies, Aristotle suggests that, quote, the sense of insult is the motive for sedition, end quote. Aristotle's use of sense here is rather telling, suggesting perhaps that it is not just the material facts of injustice that cause revolution, but also the perception of harm. Davis similarly focuses on the importance of Aristotle's phrasing, emphasizing that for Aristotle, the primary cause of political change is the perception of injustice, not the fact, but the sense of whether one has been justly treated. So here we might interpret safety valves as fabricating a sense of justice, or more specifically, in some modern contexts, fabricating a sense of democracy. Through the use of safety valves, hybrid regimes are able to appear more democratic whilst belying their illiberal or authoritarian dispositions. Likewise, Aristotle writes that the tyrant, quote, should be seen to collect taxes and to require public services only for state purposes, end quote. So in arguing that the tyrant should be seen in this manner, Aristotle is not saying that the tyrant may actually use those taxes justly. Rather, he is saying that the tyrant must appear as though they will not squander the people's money. He also suggests that the tyrant should work to win the notables by companionship and the multitudes by flattery, again, very Machiavellian, which could potentially address some of the risk that the first tyrant faces in trying to maintain the regime from within. So through these safety valves, the tyrant is able to maintain an appearance of justice and equanimity that secures their regime, leaving the people deceived into acquiescing in a change of government that does not actually usher in the material change they desire. So briefly returning to Diamond's work on democratic consolidation, I argue that in avoiding kind of the deep and routinized commitments necessary for kingliness, Aristotle's tyrant ensures that their regime does not actually become a monarchy. So in appearing to be invested in public works and in exercising moderation towards the people, the tyrant employs procedures and practices indicative of a king. And while this plan is not foolproof and the people may still resist and see through these safety valves, it does make it more difficult for people to decipher whether the tyrant is actually a tyrant. Absent in all of the tyrant's practices, however, are those normative and behavioral commitments to the specific rules and practices of monarchies. The tyrant does not actually believe that monarchy is the best solution for governing, because if they did, they would not be trying to salvage a tyranny. So like hybrid regimes, the tyrant uses kingly practices in order to preserve their power. So for Aristotle, we might think about how safety valves are ultimately mechanisms used to prevent democratic, or for Aristotle, monarchic, consolidation, ensuring that efforts at transformation are not fully realized. So far, this presentation has been very much focused on specific conversations of hybrid regimes, and I think those lend themselves to comparative politics, and a lot of conversations around the Arab Spring is where we see a lot of conversations about safety valve theory. But I would really like instead to also focus on US institutional ambiguities and how these conversations are also applicable to our present moment and to what's happening in the United States. So while the politics undoubtedly offers important implications for political theorists attempting to understand how and why did certain regimes transition to democracy, I also am interested in Aristotle's work for broader conversations about the preservation of harmful state policies and attitudes. More specifically, I'm interested in how the tyrant's manipulation of this sense or perception of justice parallels what critical legal theorists call processes of preservation through transformation. First coined in her 1997 article, Why Equal Protection No Longer Protects, the Evolving Forms of Status Enforcing State Action, Riva Siegel describes preservation through transformation as, quote, status enforcing state action evolving in form as it is contested, end quote. So looking specifically at the evolution of racial status laws during the Reconstruction era and their possible implications for modern anti-discrimination law, Siegel explores how legislators granted Black people civil rights, quote, yet denied them social rights, rationalizing laws and segregation as preserving associational liberty rather than racial hierarchy, end quote. In doing so, white legislators changed the laws so as to feign a commitment to equality while simultaneously ensuring that racial hierarchies remained. Siegel notes that the ways in which legal systems have enforced social stratification are various and evolve over time, bringing with them changes in rule structures and justificatory rhetoric. Like the hybrid regime, Siegel characterizes these status regimes as being incredibly dynamic and durable. In the face of contestation, status regimes transform in complex ways in order to ultimately ensure their survival. Like Aristotle's tyrant, then, Siegel's status regimes change in order to preserve themselves. So, although Siegel's work primarily focuses on legal systems and kind of case law history, preservation through transformation tactics can also be identified in many other state actions and attitudes. Examining how anti-Black racism did not end with the abolition of slavery and with Jim Crow laws, Michelle Alexander explains, quote, in the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race as a justification for discrimination. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind, end quote. So, like Siegel, Alexander argues that the white supremacy inherent to US society has not changed per se, but rather has taken on new forms. So Alexander writes that these new forms, quote, have been justified by new rhetoric, new language, and a new social consensus, while producing many of the same results, end quote. Jennifer Nash also identifies a similar phenomena happening in institutional policies surrounding diversity and inclusion, warning us that, quote, the work of corporate diversity, then, is not meant to transform social institutions, but to insert bodies into existing structures and even to engage in rebranding the organization, end quote. So in both of these instances, status regimes utilize an Aristotelian sense or perception of justice that ultimately maintains white supremacy while obfuscating its aims and its mechanisms. Both the racial status regimes that Alexander and Nash describe and Aristotle's tyrant make use of political safety valves and nominal processes of transformation in order to preserve their power. Like Alexander's New Jim Crow or Nash's corporate diversity, Aristotle's tyrant feigns a commitment to justice and change in order to manufacture a new social consensus and rebrand their regime. So just to conclude and think about some of the limitations and further directions of this kind of research, I want to note that despite the artificiality of some of these transformations or their limitations, important changes do still follow from the institutional use of safety valves, and numerous forms of collective action and resistance still persist under these regimes. So in no way do I want to make it seem as though the violence of safety valves is totalizing. So to think about how it fails to be totalizing, in his speech, the ethical demands for integration, Martin Luther King Jr. asserts that, quote, morality can be legislated, but behavior cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated, end quote. King makes clear that in the fight for justice, legislative changes are not wholly futile. Stressing the value of enforceable regulations, he writes, quote, judicial decrees may not change the heart, but they can restrain the heartless. The law cannot make an employer love an employee, but it can prevent him from refusing to hire me, end quote.
2 minutes, Molly.
Thank you. So for King, incremental change is still change and can perhaps lead to more robust transformations over time. This is not to suggest that law alone is sufficient in dismantling oppressive regimes and beliefs. Rather, King suggests that procedural change may actually have some impact on behavioral commitments and perhaps these behavioral consolidation overall. Aristotle, surprisingly, likewise notes the transformative possibilities of the safety valve of the tyrant. While the manipulative tyrant remains a tyrant in his account, Aristotle writes that, quote, his rule will of necessity be nobler and happier because he will rule over better men whose spirits are not crushed. He will not be wicked, but half wicked only, end quote. Interestingly, with that, some political theorists have noted that failed initial attempts at democratization within hybrid regimes may actually pave the way for successful political transformation later on, perhaps gesturing toward the political possibilities that can follow from hybrid regimes. So just to conclude, I'd like to note the continued relevance of Aristotle's work for these conversations today. Thousands of years after its inception, Aristotle's politics remains an important part of political philosophy. And just as Michelle Alexander astutely reminds us, the more things change, the more they remain the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. That was really a great paper. We have a question for you. What is the basis for holding a deep affective commitment to democracy? How is this basis violated by safety valve approaches to white supremacy?
Interesting. Okay. So how is this basis violated by safety valve approaches to white supremacy? Well, I think one thing, in thinking specifically about some of the examples with Alexander and Nash, and thinking about the safety valves of white supremacy that are operative there, is that demonstrates that perhaps within whiteness as a whole, within American society and its foundations in kind of whiteness, there are not any kind of deep epistemic or affective commitments to Black liberation, to undoing white supremacy. And this might actually maybe perhaps connect to something like Jose Medina's conversation about epistemic injustice and epistemic ignorance and epistemic laziness. So perhaps a basis for holding those deep affective and epistemic commitments would be for getting into a conversation about how we deal with epistemic resistance, how we unsettle epistemic ignorance, and how we get into those things that are perhaps below any kind of more obvious and conscious displays of racism. So some of these more systemic epistemic issues are perhaps at the heart of consolidation of these problems. I don't know if that answers that at all.
I think that's really helpful. I have a follow-up question that I wonder if you could tease out a little more is, what are effective strategies against the safety valve approaches? So thinking about white supremacy in particular, how do we get to the point where people are seeing through that and acting to change that?
That is such a cool question. So I think two parts, I really liked it. I think there are two parts. I love Medina's work. And so I think Medina's work and thinking about epistemic resistance and getting into moments where we're troubled in that epistemic ignorance would be good. And thinking about really sitting in moments of epistemic friction for white folks. I think a secondary thing would just be a committed return to what are the principles that are motivating us? What are the foundational beliefs we have? And then when we see something like, let's say, kind of diversity being used in a very strange way with pro-police forces or something like that in response to Black Lives Matter, what is it doing? What is the foundational hope that we want to strive for? What are the virtues? What are the goals? And are those changes actually getting at those? And that's difficult. That's very difficult work. But thinking about what gets lost in those movements and what needs to be a part of any kind of fight for liberation.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. And I like that because you bring us back to Aristotle, we get that sense of the long-termness of these principles that can be motivating for these changes. So excellent paper. Thank you, Molly.
Am
now,
I able to, sorry, am I able to voice a question?
Absolutely, please do.
Cool, awesome. So thanks so much, Molly. That was great. I guess just a couple of things. So just one on Aristotle, and like you're gonna have to forgive me for not being able to follow every part of your paper. It was so sort of dense. And I really love that deeply. I have like a sort of deep affection for the sort of philosophically rigorous work, but it did make it, for me at least, I don't know, maybe I don't speak for everyone, but I'm still working through it. Two things you might think about. Aristotle's reply to the tyrant, at least in part, is motivated. I think there's a case to be made, at least, that in the rhetoric at 1373 B5 in the Becker numbers, Aristotle holds that there's such a thing as universal natural justice and universal natural injustice, and I think that motivates a pretty strong case for some of democracy's sort of central normative claims about how we ought to treat others. That's one place. And then Danielle and I were actually in a panel this morning on nonviolence, and it was kind of interesting. I was thinking of a line that, again, might be just worth perusing for your own work. And it's in Metaphysics Lambda, and it's somewhere in the latter half of Metaphysics Lambda, and it's where Aristotle points out that things are related to one another in a sort of deep, fundamental and ontological way, that nothing sort of exists in isolation. And I think that motivates a sort of interpersonal reading of Aristotle, at least. So those are two references in Aristotle that you might find worthwhile. And that was it. I think I had some other things, but I think those two are fine. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. That's fantastic.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That is such a great transition. And one of the things I so deeply appreciate about Concerned Philosophers for Peace is our genuine interest in each other's work and helpfulness, because as I'm sure you all know, not all of our philosophy conferences are quite that way. So I'm going to transition us now to Rashad Rehman from the University of Toronto, who is speaking to us today about Amor est cosa pacis, a Peperian reading of Aquinas's theory of peace.
All right, thanks, Danielle. So I actually have it timed, so I'll be sort of mindful of time on my end, if that makes your life easier. I know it's kind of unfortunate sometimes when you have to like wave or something, to give the the 5-minute mark. So thanks so much to the Concerned Philosophers for Peace sort of organizers. I've enjoyed my time here so far, and let's get right into it. So yes, as Danielle said, I'm going to be presenting basically on Aquinas's commentary on the Gospel of St. John, particularly one small lecture within it, 14:7, so it's sort of very specific. And there's going to be a lot of unanswered questions. This is a work in progress talk, which I hope is okay. But I ran the presentation a few times, and it seems like I'll have a couple minutes at the end, so I'll do my best to give some qualifications. All right, so let's get into it. All right. So to modern readers, the statement "love is the cause of peace" is apt to be regarded either as a pithy, sloganeered truism of a more hopeful, distant past, where in a world not able to destroy itself by its own devices, we were able to speak of love and peace in the same breath. Or instead, we view it as the bedrock upon which a just society is procured. Again, it might be questioned whether in a pluralistic society, we're going to even agree on what love and peace mean, and whether therefore these various conflicting meanings could, even in principle, have effective socio-political application. So to the one who simply rejects the legitimacy of love and peace in the modern world, either descriptively or normatively, it should be noted that talk of peace isn't really avoidable. Ordinary English is saturated with what we might call peace talk, right? Like peaceful protests, religions of peace, peaceful politics, making peace with someone, peace offerings, and so forth. So like, notwithstanding possible reactions evoked by love as the cause of peace, it might surprise the modern reader that the quote which began and entitles this paper is from the Latin medieval philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas. Hereafter, I'll just call him Aquinas, in his commentary on the Gospel of St. John, and is consequently a translation of his Latin. This line, it's amoris causa pacis. So this paper has two aims. First, it exegetes Aquinas' notion of peace, or pax, in his commentary, which is centered around the definition, kinds, and possibility of a perfected peace, as well as how love is the cause of peace. Second, rather than defending Aquinas' position at length, I take the more humble task to defend one attractive, plausible feature of Aquinas' position, showing how it reveals medieval wisdom in the establishment of modern peace. So the position of Aquinas is twofold. First, Aquinas' position, at least how Joseph Pieper read him, is that love is essentially the affirmation of the goodness of the existence of the other person. I read this as an empirically supported, philosophically plausible source of peace. This thesis also reiterates Aquinas' rejection of, and I'll make the distinction later, but monadic theories of peace, which hold that peace need only be outward, exterius, for example, by fighting for socio-political peace by fighting for human rights, say, and not inward, interius. And that would be something like peace with oneself by cultivating the inner life. Second, Aquinas' position that love and not other candidates like tolerance, for example, as the cause of peace, is in my view an attractive or as an alternative plausible position that merits critical attention. All right. So in the commentary, which was written around 1269 to 1272, Aquinas writes that love is the cause of peace. In context, Aquinas is commenting on the Gospel of St. John 14:27 in the New Testament, in which Jesus says the following: peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you, not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your heart be troubled, nor let it be afraid. The Koine Greek for peace operative here is the feminine noun eirene, a term which appears in various morphologies approximately 100 times in the Greek New Testament. Among its translations are our ordinary English uses and adopts frequently. Peace, oneness, quiet, rest. These are sort of equally legitimate translations of this Greek term. For the purposes of clarity, I'll stick to the more frequent translation of peace, although the Greek accentuates other features of peace that Aquinas' Latin also will highlight. Aquinas' commentary on 1427 reveals an important investment in the theory of peace, for what the Greek New Testament authors designated as eirene became pax in Latin. I'll now explicate a brief exegesis of Aquinas' commentary here. So Aquinas' definition of peace, or what he calls the gift of peace, donum pacis, is as follows: peace is nothing else than the tranquility arising from order. For things are said to have peace when their order remains undisturbed. For Aquinas, within human beings, there's a threefold order: a person to themselves, a person to God, and a person to their neighbor. Hence, tripartite order within a person implies the possibility of a tripartite peace: interior peace, peace with oneself, that is to say, having settled faculties, not being ruled by the emotions; peace with God, conformed to his direction; and peace with neighbors, that is to say, with all human beings. To understand Aquinas' threefold order, it's important here to make two distinctions. First, with respect to the definition of peace, and second, with respect to characterizing the constitutive elements of peace. So first, the distinction between a privative and positive definition of peace. A privative definition of peace is a theory of peace which defines peace in negative terms by lacks, privations, and so forth. So for example, a theory of peace which specifies the absence of war, strife, and oppression as the definition of peace. Contrarily, a positive theory of peace holds that peace is constituted by a present positive feature of reality. In Aquinas' case, peace is defined by the presence of tranquility which arises on the basis of the threefold order. Second, the distinction between a monadic and tripartite constitution of peace. So the former, monadic, holds that peace is composed of one essential feature that constitutes the presence or existence of peace. By contrast, the latter, the tripartite constitution of peace, holds that peace is composed of three essential elements that jointly, necessarily, and sufficiently constitute peace. Aquinas naturally is a tripartitist. Aquinas then writes that the human person is ordered in the following way: the ordering of our intellect, will, and sense appetency or appetite. The will should be led by reason or mind, and the sense appetite should be led by the intellect and will. And this is a position that was sort of widely adopted in Aquinas's medieval context. And it has its roots in Plato's Phaedo and Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and a bunch of other places. And I have it here footnoted that although that there is this Greek philosophical backdrop, Aquinas's authority here is actually Augustine. Right. So it's here that Aquinas distinguishes imperfect from perfect peace. He calls the peace of this world imperfect because it consists of a disturbed peace with ourselves, neighbor, and God. On the other hand, perfect peace, the peace that is enjoyed in heaven, that the saints enjoy, will be enjoyed in the future and will not involve the fragmented, imperfect peace of this world. Aquinas then writes that Jesus was clear to his disciples what kind of peace he would leave with them: a present peace in this world for defeating the devil and loving others, and eternal peace in the future. For Aquinas, without Christ there is no peace either in the former or in the latter case. With respect to present peace, the author is Christ via his example, and in future peace, it's through Christ's strength and power. Potestate et virtutum. He then sets out to distinguish the specific ways in which imperfect peace is fundamentally different from perfect peace. First, the purpose or intent is different. So imperfect peace's goal or purpose is the calm enjoyment of temporal things. And it's imperfect because it oftentimes facilitates wrongdoing. Perfect peace, on the other hand, is ordered towards eternal goods. Second, imperfect peace is a simulated peace, simulatio, since peace with one's neighbor is a poor criteria of peace. It can often mask, for example, a lack of peace within oneself. However, perfect peace, which is true, as St. Thomas says, and not simulated, has a threefold order that, when present, constitutes real peace. Third, perfect and imperfect peace differ with respect to their perfection. Imperfect peace only concerns itself with externals. It's not within and without, interius et exterius. However, Aquinas writes, the peace of Christ brings tranquility both within and without. So Aquinas rejects that we should think of peace as only an exterior act, for example, by fighting for human rights, say. Instead, we should think of peace as the experience of tranquility arising from the order within us, with our neighbors, and with God. So in other words, it's a holistic theory of peace. At this point, I want to defend a plausible, socio-politically effective feature of Aquinas' account, which does not necessarily rely on his theological presuppositions. So just a bit of a disclaimer. So part of the sort of force of the paper, I think, is that it wants to motivate a distinctive feature of Aquinas' account and not necessarily defend his entire thesis at length. So we could take 14.7 to be a theory of peace of sorts, which requires theological justification, since it's essentially a commentary on the Gospel of St. John. But in my view, I mean, like, at least for the purposes of the conference, you know, I wonder to myself, okay, let's say someone doesn't hold Aquinas' theological presuppositions. What feature of his account might be philosophically defensible in its own right, and therefore socio-politically effective in a pluralistic society? That's kind of the motivation. So here's the kind of feature of his account that I think is quite plausible on those grounds. So just to recap, Aquinas on peace in the commentary refers to an articulation of a tripartite definition of peace, in which the threefold order of the human person maps onto a threefold peace, the latter constituting jointly, necessarily, and sufficiently the existence of peace. However, what we don't get from the commentary is what Aquinas means by love. It's the task of the reader of Aquinas, then, to make sense of Aquinas' theory of love as the basis upon which they predicate to him a particular thesis regarding the cause of peace, if love is the cause of peace. While Aquinas is often read as espousing a theory of love as essentially willing the good of the other, which of course has its basis in Aristotle's Rhetoric in Book 2, I source Aquinas' fundamental contention about love in the work of Pieper. As I read the second chapter of Pieper's 1972 Über der Liebe, on love, he sets out to explicate a Thomistic theory of the heterogeneity of love, that is, an account of the common element in experiences of love, which explains its various expressions, familial, friendship, romantic, and so forth. Pieper writes, but if the recurrent identity underlying the countless forms of love does exist, how can it be more exactly described? In Pieper's case, I take him to be inquiring into the cognitive heterogeneity of love, namely a specification of what cognitive feature, if any, is common to all experiences of love. So Pieper surveys various theories of love, and his conclusion is that, quote, all these attempts to describe phenomenologically what love is really about ascribe to it the power to sustain existence, keeping the beloved in being, conferring the right to exist, giving existence, and even annulment of death and mortality, end quote. So there are two aspects that are involved in these theories, and the former encompasses a plausible answer to the heterogeneity of love. So love, in other words, is the affirmation of the goodness of the existence of the other. In every conceivable case, love signifies much the same as approval. So this means that loving someone or something means finding them or it probus, the Latin word for good. It is a way of turning to them or it saying, it's good that you exist, it's good that you are in this world. As an expression of the will, voluntas, love therefore means I want you or it to exist. It is a purely affirmative assent to what already is, in Pieper's words. So I give three motivating arguments for Pieper's position, independent of the theological justification Pieper gives, which, if any of you are interested, is just Genesis 1:1. Sorry, it's in the first chapter of Genesis, not Genesis 1:1. So first, by a disjunctive syllogism, relative to other candidates for the heterogeneity of love, affirmation in its many forms, approval, acceptance, what's sometimes called being an ally, which is not morally neutral as it's often used, but nevertheless expresses a form of unconditionality in one's acceptance of another, is the most plausible act that's common to all experiences of love. So although emotions, for example, appear to be a strong candidate, they're not a good criteria since they're not present in many experiences of love. And so it couldn't be a source or explanation of the heterogeneity of love. Second, the presupposition of many existing forms of love is a primal act of the will, which expresses, if only implicitly, affirmation, even in non-intuitive cases, for example, like tough love. Finally, Pieper's thesis has, I think, empirical support. So, and I rely here on, for example, an entire psychotherapeutic practice, which has as its core metaphysical presupposition that the client with whom the professional psychotherapist is speaking is ontologically good. And this is sort of explicitly affirmed in practice. So it's an affirmative theory of psychotherapy. And for those who are interested, it's the Romanian psychologist Alexandria Parvan who has spearheaded this project, who's both actually a specialist on Augustine and a professional psychologist, which is pretty cool. So with respect to socio-political application, I argue there are three reasons why it's applicable. So first, it directly and not indirectly addresses the explicit presence of hatred in contemporary socio-political discourse, much of it taking place on social media platforms, but we have a lot of other political examples as well. By arguing for a substantive concept of love, it provides a corrective to the various manifestations of hatred that disestablish peace. Second, it also provides a corrective to implicit forms of hatred in which opposite sides of the political spectrum regard one another as undeserving of listening, attention, and discussion. Each of these, sort of in and of themselves good, predicated on the underlying premise that the other is affirmed ontologically, even if disagreed with fiercely. So finally, Aquinas' position pushes for socio-political direct action for peace without itself embodying and perpetuating an attitude of indifference and hatred. In many ways, it shares the same philosophical justification as, say, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent direct action campaign. However, an alternative to Aquinas' position that love is the cause of peace is worth considering. So tolerance, from the Latin tolerantia, which actually connoted bigotry only in 1765, that was the earliest sort of reference I could find, is oftentimes praised as a cardinal virtue of a pluralistic society within which a variety of values, practices, beliefs, and moral differences exist. However, what is meant by tolerance is often ambiguous. It either means the disposition of permitting, allowing, or accepting other beliefs and actions, or it can also mean the philosophical anthropological thesis that human beings are such that they're worthy of toleration. So there are unambiguous cases where tolerance is morally acceptable, and where intolerance is morally unacceptable. So for example, when one tolerates different cultural practices from one's own, like the wearing of different attire, one goes against ethnocentric tendencies and embraces differences cross-culturally. However, discrimination based on another's religious beliefs is clearly an intolerant practice which is morally unacceptable. But nevertheless, just as there are clear cases where tolerance is morally acceptable and intolerance morally unacceptable, there are also cases where tolerance is morally unacceptable and intolerance morally acceptable. And I have in mind, for example, the immoral practice of female genital mutilation, which still happens today, which should not be tolerated. That is to say, in many cases, intolerance isn't merely morally permissible, but it's morally obligatory. Put clearly, we should not tolerate immoral practices even within a pluralistic society. Again, one of those central claims is sort of moral realism, or, sort of against moral pluralism. So again, that's something I can address after. So, however, beyond the moral obligation of intolerance, there is a further problem with tolerance that I'll briefly advance here, though it can be seen as an ancillary argument to the former one. The objection presses the question whether human beings are the kinds of beings who are worthy of being treated as an object of toleration or accepted in such a way that their existence is affirmed as fundamentally good, and which of these is a better sustainable candidate for establishing peace. My argument says that tolerance says that one should treat others as an object of toleration, but on the other hand, I think that this is a mistaken attitude for at least two reasons. So first, I think this permits an inhuman indifference towards others, or at least it licenses that kind of indifference. On tolerance, your moral obligation is to just tolerate another's behaviors, practices, values, and beliefs. But this makes no moral demand on you to care for another, right? And furthermore, and this is secondly, this inhuman indifference appears also to be a vicious character quality. So for example, the vice of cold-heartedness. And here I rely on the moral theory of Donald DeMarco in his work, The Many Faces of Virtue, looking at some of those under-discussed virtues like cold-heartedness. For these reasons, tolerance doesn't seem to be a plausible source of peace, at least one which should be aimed at socio-politically. So I think I've got 1 minute and 20 seconds, so I'm just going to recap here and then I'll end it here. So this paper had two modest aims. First, it just performed an exegesis of Aquinas' notion of peace in the commentary on the Gospel of St. John 14:7, which was a commentary on St. John 14:27, which is centered around the definition, kinds, and possibilities of a perfected peace, as well as how love is the cause of peace. Second, rather than defending Aquinas' position at length, I took the more humble task to defend one attractive, plausible feature of Aquinas' position, showing how it reveals medieval wisdom in the establishment of modern peace. Aquinas' position, as we saw, was twofold. First, at least how people read him, love is essentially the affirmation of the goodness of the existence of the other person, and I read this as an empirically supported, plausible source of peace. This thesis also reiterated Aquinas' rejection of monadic theories of peace, which hold that peace need only be outward, exterius, and not inward, interius. And second, I argued that Aquinas' position that love, and not other candidates like tolerance, as the cause of peace is an alternative, plausible position that merits critical attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was incredibly interesting. I'm going to start with a comment from the question and answer, and says, just a comment that I am reminded of Hopkins' poem on peace, which deals poetically with threefolds. I wonder whether he was making any reference to Aquinas and how the two takes on peace might interact. So,
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm familiar with some of Hopkins. You mean like Gerard Manley Hopkins, is that right?
I think so. I don't know. Can we?
I think that's his. If we're talking about the English poet, I'm familiar with some of his work, but not that. So that's actually super interesting. I will take a look into that.
Yeah.
That's a much appreciated reference.
Yeah. Tiamat thing might be typing in. Yes, that's exactly who they're talking about. He was
Okay.
super Catholic, so it probably does have an overlap. That's really interesting.
I will.
Would any of our other panelists like to ask a question? Oh, excellent. Thank you. Everyone is now a panelist, so please feel free
Good.
to jump in and ask questions if you have any.
There was one in the chat I can briefly just address.
Okay. Oh, great. I'm glad you said that.
Yeah. So the question is, given that Aquinas connects peace to order, how static or dynamic is his concept of order, and how would that translate to modern sensibilities of dynamic systems, for example, of peace? Well, I mean, I'm not sure. Okay, so with respect to Aquinas' distinction between like threefold orders, for example, like with respect to peace, but also the human person, um, in my view, I think that it's relatively static, at least in its specification of the kinds of order that there are. That seems to be straightforward. With respect to the application of Aquinas' threefold orders, that seems to be utterly dynamic. And Aquinas was familiar with this kind of thinking, and I hope this addresses directly the question. Um, so, for example, there's this sort of argument against medieval ethics in general that it was, or principled ethics in general, that it's sort of really static and doesn't make room for the particularities of moral circumstances. But but in fact, like the medieval virtue of prudence, for example, was utterly cognizant of the fact that, like, in order to make a good decision, you need full information of all of the details uh, of a moral situation, which is very difficult in some cases, especially when you have socio-politically complex institutions, right? As Molly was pointing out in her presentation as well, it gets really tricky. And in the same way, I think that while Aquinas's sort of specification of his threefold orders are themselves static, their application is dynamic. So, for example, take like a commitment to establishing peace with one's neighbor, right? You might be motivated, for example, to think, okay, well, maybe this is anthropocentric. Maybe that just, like, why think of only our neighbors, for example? Well, I've talked to some environmentalists about this, and one really interesting thing is, well, maybe an environmentalist can accommodate Aquinas by saying, look, insofar as the environment affects human beings specifically, you can motivate an argument that, well, harmony with the environment is important because it affects your neighbors. Now, you might be convinced by saying, well, maybe that sort of specifies the wrong reason, say, for preserving the environment. Nevertheless, you get the sort of inclusion of the environment tagged along just for different reasons. So I think that, yeah, the order is definitely static. I hope that addressed your question. I think there's a follow-up. Let me see.
Really helpful. Greg just also points out that
Oh.
neighbor, God are also King's three dimensions of a complete life. And I would agree with that. And also that emphasis that peace can't just be this monadic, external facing. This really, anytime you have somebody working to do system level transformation, it's so integral to that work. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. That was great.
All right. Well, in the interest of keeping us on schedule, thank you, Rashad. I think that was wonderful.